Hello everyone, this is my presentation for Indigenous Studies 201, The Impact of Colonization on Khoikhoi Peoples of South Africa by Jon Wilde. Okay, so here's some background information. The Khoikhoi people inhabited South Africa beginning 2,000 years ago. They lived a pastoral lifestyle, herding sheep and cattle. So they sought out pastures near the coast in modern-day Namibia and the Eastern Cape. So they were a nomadic society, so that means that they moved around often according to the seasons to find grazing lands for their animals. Their houses were very light and easy to set up and take down because of this. 1652, the Dutch East India Company established settlement in the Cape and began trading with Khoikhoi peoples. Some of the things that they traded were sheep, cattle, ivory, ostrich feathers, for shells, for beads, metal objects, tobacco, and alcohol with the Dutch. They did not trade guns with the Khoikhoi people because they were afraid they would use them on them. So the result of this settlement was the Khoikhoi people lost land and cattle as the settlement grew. There was also conflicts and wars, and because the Khoikhoi people had no guns, they were very disadvantaged during these wars, and so they lost. And then in 1713, smallpox epidemic started. And they were very disadvantaged because they had no immunity for these European diseases, and they died by the thousands. There's an estimated 90% of the Khoikhoi population wiped out by this epidemic. In 1899 to 1902, there was the Boer War between Britain and Dutch for control over the territory. Britain ended up winning this war, and then Britain gained control over the colonies in South Africa. Okay, so the foundation for apartheid laws. In 1910, Britain established the South Africa Act. So this established the Union of South Africa, so this is the beginning of white supremacy in South Africa. 1911, the Mines and Works Act. So this only allowed blacks to receive cheap labor. High-paying jobs are only given to whites. So there was a lot of racism around this. The black population were not trained the same as whites, which limited them in the jobs they were qualified for. So 1913, the Native Lands Act. So this forced 10% of blacks to be sent to reserves. It also prohibited blacks from owning land outside of those confined reserves. So this impacted the Khoikhoi people largely because they were not included in this because most of their land was already dispossessed prior to Britain taking control of the colony. So in 1920, passed the Native Affairs Act. This was a tribally based but still government appointed district councils. So they had representatives for government from the tribes, but it was still controlled by the government, so there was still not a whole lot of say there for them. In 1923, the Native Urban Areas Act. So this controlled how often blacks were able to go into cities and towns. 1936, the Native Representation Act. So blacks were only allowed to vote for white parliament members. Okay, so apartheid in 1948. This was a segregation of races between white and black. So the idea was to separate blacks into smaller zones based on preventing them from uniting. So because the indigenous people were the majority of the population, the government was afraid that they would unite because they could overthrow them. So this is kind of the idea behind apartheid. Group Areas Act separated blacks into assigned areas of living, created their own nation. They were not considered South African under this. So the pass system was implemented. This restricted indigenous people to their own areas. In order to go into white areas, they required a pass. Permit system, this prevented blacks from operating their businesses in white areas. 1953, the Separate Amenities Act was stated that facilities which were racially separate did not have to be equal. So there were better facilities for white people. It was one of the largest forms of oppression during the time. So in 1989, apartheid was abolished and South Africa became a democracy. Okay, so the impact of apartheid on Khoikhoi peoples. So during apartheid, they were labeled as colored people, so they weren't considered Khoikhoi, so this was resulting in a loss of identity. It was neglecting their distinct identity as people, so it was another form of racism. So they were dispossessed from their lands, resulted by forced relocation policies. Segregation from schools, restaurants as a result of Group Areas Act. In 1956, Khoikhoi peoples were removed from the voters' roll in South Africa, basically making them their political participation. They removed them from political participation in the country. So they were socially and politically invisible during this time. So some of the post-apartheid effects for the Khoikhoi people. So after it was over, they were demanding recognition as a distinct group after being called colored for so many years. They were desiring for a reaffirmation of their indigenous heritage, recognizing geographic rootedness, sense of belonging, entitlement, and ownership. So in 1994, the Land Restitution Act was put forward, but it did not affect the Khoikhoi people because after the Native Lands Act, their land was not included in this because they had already lost their land in the early colonial history with the Dutch, and when Britain took over, that didn't transfer over, so that land was pretty much lost to them. So in 2010, they had legal proceedings. They brought forward a case, the Cultural Genocide and Discrimination Against the Khoisan Nation, brought to Equality Court. So this court case, they were demanding proper title for identity after being called colored, demanded government recognition of leadership, and also for all 18 clans of the Khoikhoi peoples. So the continued displacement of lands has resulted in increasing loss of identity for Khoikhoi peoples. In 2012, there was a legal case for land claims brought forward to the Pretoria government, but still nothing is being done about these land claims, so they're still ongoing. Okay, so the loss of language. So the Khoikhoi language is not a recognized language in South Africa today. There are 11 official languages in South Africa, and not one of these is Khoikhoi. The population is still very small that still speaks this language. There's no written record of the language. So more recently, language is beginning to be taught in schools and written into books as an attempt to revive the Khoikhoi language, but there's no legal policies forcing government to implement the language into society, which is becoming frustrating for these people. Okay, so current issues impacting Khoikhoi peoples in South Africa. The Khoikhoi peoples are not recognized as indigenous peoples due to the near extinction of their people in the early colonial past. They continue to be classified as colored, so no official identity on their South African constitution. So this is problematic as they're searching for their identity, but they aren't even being recognized. So the ongoing policy reform with no progress being made. So some examples of this: in 1999, Nelson Mandela, the president at the time, established the National Khoisan Council. Council is a negotiating forum set up to address the constitutional accommodation of the Khoikhoi's traditional leadership within the traditional leadership constitutional framework. So despite 18 years of this existence, this council still continues to find itself in negotiations with no progress being made. Another example is the pending National Traditional Affairs Bill of 2010. So this does make room for recognition of Khoikhoi leadership, but is still awaiting approval after 8 years. So it's very similar to Canada, is that there's a lot of talk about these things, but there's no action being done. So dispossession of land has resulted in lack of resources and poverty. This dispossession of land has resulted in the hindering of economic development and cultural survival for these people. Poverty and dependency on external resources to survive. Main concern for these people is to re-establish access to natural resources necessary for pastoralism, hunting, gathering, or farming. So poverty has resulted in also the government is not providing social services for them. There's been instances of police brutality and lack of access to justice services for the Khoikhoi people. So ongoing land claims. In 2013, the President Jacob Zuma announced the government's willingness to consider historical land claims for the Khoikhoi peoples. However, they still continue to experience serious challenges in terms of access, ownership, and post-settlement support regarding land claims. So another one is that their socio-economic status has been severely impacted. The Khoikhoi peoples are some of the poorest population groups in South Africa. They are stigmatized as the underclass by dominant sectors of society, poor wages and no rights for workers. The children, youth, and women are vulnerable to discrimination, violence, drug abuse, high suicide rates, prostitution, alcoholism, and other mental illnesses associated with poverty. There are high domestic violence and murder rates with weapons on women, as well as HIV and AIDS rate is alarmingly high in South Africa. So these are some issues that they face. Okay, so here's my reference page, and that is my presentation. So hope you all enjoyed, and thank you for listening.